Alina returned home late. The autumn wind was whistling through the windows and rain was pounding on the roof. She turned on the light in the hallway, took off her shoes, and went straight to her room. It had been a hard day, and all she wanted to do was fall into bed. Alina threw her bag on the floor and sat down on the bed, unwinding her scarf. But something made her freeze. In the silence, she heard a strange sound, a faint rustling, as if someone was moving something under the bed. "A cat?" she muttered, but then remembered that her cat had disappeared a few days ago and hadn't returned. Her heart began to beat faster. Alina leaned over, trying to look under the bed, but at that moment the light in the room suddenly flickered on and off. Darkness enveloped her, and only the light from the corridor faintly penetrated through the open door. The rustling again. This time closer. "Who is it?" she asked, trying to make her voice stern, but it came out shaky. There was no answer. Only a long breath that could not possibly belong to a person. Now her fear turned into panic. She slowly lowered her feet to the floor, hoping to get up silently and run for the door. But as her toes touched the carpet, something cold and wet grabbed her ankle. Alina screamed and jerked her foot away, but the hands, thin and bony, held her ever tighter. She tried to get free, but the force pulled her down, straight to the floor. Her head hit the edge of the bed and everything went black for a moment. When she came to, she realized that she was lying on the floor, but she could no longer see the light from the corridor. The darkness was as thick as pitch. She heard a soft giggle right next to her ear. "Did you think I was gone?" a voice whispered, hoarse and deep. Something started pulling her under the bed. Her scream faded into silence. The next day, the police found the room empty. There were no signs of a struggle, only deep scratches on the floor under the bed and a few clumps of hair. The bed was still in place. But now everyone who entered the room could hear rustling in the silence. After Alina disappeared, her apartment became empty. Her relatives tried to sort out her belongings, but everyone who stayed there for a long time felt a strange coldness and a constant sense of someone else's presence. A few months later, the apartment came to a realtor, and it was quickly rented to a young couple. Dasha and Andrei had just started living together, and were looking for an inexpensive place to live. The old house and furniture did not scare them. "It's cozy here," Dasha said, looking around the room. "Although the bed is a little old. We'll replace it later." Andrei waved his hand. The first few days passed quietly. However, on the third night, Dasha woke up to a strange sound. She lay in the dark, listening. It sounded like someone was tapping softly on the floor. "Andrei, do you hear that?" she whispered, nudging the boyfriend in the side. "What?" He opened his eyes sleepily. But the sound stopped. Dasha thought she was just imagining things and fell asleep. The next night, it happened again, but this time the sound was louder. It wasn't just a knocking sound, it was like something sharp scraping against wood. Dasha woke Andrei up again. "There's something under the bed," she said, squeezing his hand. "Come on, it's probably rats." "I'll check tomorrow," he muttered and turned to the other side. But in the morning, they found nothing under the bed except a few strange scratches on the wooden floor. Andrei dismissed it as an old apartment, the wood was warping. However, Dasha began to feel that it was not just an old floor. On the fifth day, she couldn't take it anymore. At night, when the sound started again, she turned on the flashlight on her phone and cautiously leaned over to look under the bed. It was dark, too dark, even for the low light. It seemed that there was not a floor under the bed, but an emptiness. She swept the light of the flashlight across the darkness, and suddenly something glinted back. A pair of eyes, large, black, deep as the abyss. Dasha recoiled and dropped her phone. At the same moment, a hand came out from under the bed, long and bony, with claws that glistened in the light of the phone. She screamed, but Andrei didn't even have time to get out of bed. Something pulled her down with incredible force. Her arms disappeared under the bed, then her legs. At the last moment, her face turned to the boy. He saw horror and tears in her eyes. "Save me!" she screamed, but her voice quickly sank into silence. Andrei froze, not believing what had happened. He was shaking, but he mustered up the courage to look under the bed. There was nothing there. Only darkness that seemed alive. The next day, the police inspected the apartment again. All they found was Andrei sitting in the corner of the room, muttering something about eyes, hands, and darkness. Since then, no one else has entered the room. And those who passed by said that sometimes, when it got dark, they could hear a quiet rustling and giggling coming from the room. Years passed, but the apartment remained empty. People began to avoid even mentioning it. Locals whispered that everyone who entered the apartment heard rustling under the bed and felt invisible eyes watching them. One day, a "for rent" sign appeared on the door of the apartment. This time, the tenant was Mikola, an elderly man who did not believe in any legends or scary stories. He was a former investigator, and had heard enough horror stories at work to ignore fiction. Cheap and comfortable, he muttered as he looked around the apartment. The bed, although old, seemed sturdy. Nikolai decided to leave it there. The first nights passed quietly. No sounds, no rustling. Mikola had already started to think that all these rumors were fabrications. But on the fourth night, something changed. He woke up from a sudden cold. Opening his eyes, he saw that the window was closed, the radiators were warm, but the frost was chilling him to the bone. An unnatural silence reigned in the room so deep that even his own breathing sounded too loud. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a familiar sound, a faint rustling, barely audible, but it made my hair stand on end. "Who's there?" Mikola asked sternly, getting out of bed. He took a flashlight and cautiously crouched down to look under the bed. His professional habit was to check everything rationally first. The light of the flashlight cut through the darkness. At first, he saw nothing. But when he was about to straighten up, something under the bed moved. A shadow. It seemed to be just a shadow. But it was too dense, too real. And it was looking at him. Suddenly, the darkness began to spread as if it were alive. It moved like thick black smoke, enveloping his legs. Mikola recoiled, but a hand appeared in the darkness, thin, long, with claws. "It's you again," he whispered, backing away. This was not the first time Mikola had encountered something like this. Years ago, during one of his investigations, he had heard about similar disappearances. But no one could explain what it was. The darkness reached out to him, but he pulled an old silver cross from his pocket that he had carried since his youth. Waving it in front of him, he spoke loudly. "If you are a demon or something else, get out of here." The darkness stopped. For a moment, everything froze, and then I heard a shrill hiss. Something under the bed began to squirm, to retreat back into the depths. Without wasting any time, Mikola grabbed the phone and called a priest he knew, Father Iyer. "Come over right away. Something is very wrong here." When Father Iyer arrived, Mikola was already standing on the threshold, not wanting to go inside. The priest examined the room and performed the rite of blessing. But during the prayer, he heard rustling from under the bed again. "It's here," said Father Iyer, clutching the cross. "And it's not just a ghost. It is an old evil that lives in this place." He began to say his prayers louder, and the darkness under the bed began to thicken. Suddenly it burst out, forming something like a human figure, tall, thin, with eyes that glowed red. "Is this your house?" the father shouted, pointing the cross at the figure. "Mine!" she hissed, her voice chilling to the bone. The shadow began to recede as the water from the blessed bottle touched its edge. It hissed and disintegrated like smoke. When it was over, the priest said, "This place is cursed. But it seems we have let it go." Mikola was silent, but he knew that this story was not over yet. A few days later, the house was demolished. But those who passed by the ruins said that at night they could still hear a faint rustling, and in the shadows they could see red eyes. The story of this spirit began many years ago, even before the house itself was built. The land on which it stood had a dark past. It is said that back in the 17th century, people lived here who were engaged in forbidden rites and black rituals. Once, during such a ritual, something unpredictable happened. A group of people, trying to summon a supernatural force, awakened something that did not obey any laws of the world of the living. That creature had no name, it was simply called darkness. It had no shape, but it could absorb people's fears and desires, making it stronger. The ritual ended tragically. All of its participants died under mysterious circumstances. Their bodies were found at dawn, twisted in grotesque positions. Their eyes were black, as if burned from the inside. But their souls, according to witnesses, remained trapped on this earth, obeying the darkness. Over the years, the place was forgotten. An ordinary residential building was built on it, but the energy that remained did not disappear. The darkness was there, waiting to be disturbed. The first case happened to the builders. One of the workers went missing, and his comrades felt that someone was watching them. But they attributed it to fatigue and accident. When people started living in the house, the darkness found a way to reassert itself. It penetrated dreams, fueled by fears, and sometimes took those who were most vulnerable. But its strongest connection was with the bed in that ill-fated room. The bed stood in the same place where the last ritual had been performed many years ago. It became a portal between the world of the living and the world where the darkness existed. Everyone who lay on this bed sooner or later attracted her attention. Every time she took someone under the bed, her power grew. She couldn't leave the place completely, but the more fear and sacrifices, the stronger she became. The priest who performed the ceremony realized that this was no ordinary ghost. It was an ancient entity stuck between worlds. It was impossible to destroy it completely, but it was possible to expel it, to weaken it so that it would fall back into sleep. Why this particular apartment? The darkness is tied to the place where blood was once shed and the balance between the worlds was upset. And although the house was destroyed, the essence did not disappear. It is still connected to the earth. Now it is waiting for people to build something on this place again. And then the darkness will return. Who will be the first to enter the new house? A few years after the building was demolished, construction began on a modern residential complex. The tall glass skyscraper was supposed to be a symbol of progress and comfort, but the locals did not believe in its success. They whispered that the land under the new building was cursed, that it was alive and remembered everything that had happened here. However, the developers ignored the superstitions. When the construction was completed, the apartments in the new building were quickly sold out. People started moving in, and nothing unusual happened during the first year. Until one evening a young family moved in on the 10th floor, Oleg, his wife Marina, and their little daughter Sonia. Their apartment was spacious, with panoramic windows and a view of the city. But Sonia liked her new room the most. "Daddy, can I sleep in this bed?" the girl asked when she saw the unusual bed that the developers had left in the room as a gift for the first tenants. The bed was dark, with carved legs in the shape of vines, and although it looked old, it was sturdy and surprisingly well preserved. I'm surprised they didn't take it away," Ola muttered, looking at the bed. "If you like it, we'll leave it," Marina decided. Sonia was delighted. But on the first night, something went wrong. The girl woke up in the middle of the night, and heard something scratching under the bed. She thought it was just their cat hiding under there, so she leaned over to take a look. "Fluffy?" she called out. But instead of a cat, a pair of sparkling eyes looked at her from the darkness. Sonia screamed, and her parents ran into the room. They reassured her, saying that it was just a bad dream, but when Oleg looked under the bed, he saw nothing. "You must have imagined something, dear," he said, smiling. But the next night, Sonia woke up screaming again. "It's calling me," she sobbed. "It wants me to come to it." This time Marina decided to move her daughter to their bedroom. But at night she had a strange dream herself. She saw the same room, only empty, and something was moving under the bed, like a living shadow reaching out to her. When she woke up, the apartment was cold, even though the radiators were working. Marina went to check Sonia's room and froze. The door they had closed at night was open. The bed was still there, but it looked different, darker, older, and the carvings on the legs seemed to be moving. "It's just fatigue," Marina assured herself and quickly closed the door. But the miracles were just beginning. On the third night, Sonia disappeared. Her room was empty, the windows were closed, and there was no one under the bed again. Only darkness, which seemed thicker than usual. While the police began investigating, Ola and Marina stayed in the apartment, waiting for news. But the darkness in the room became more and more palpable. They heard whispers coming from deep under the bed, saw things in the room moving by themselves. They called the priest, but when he saw the bed, he just shook his head. "It's not just a thing," he said. "It's a portal. Your daughter has not left home. She is there." "Where is she?" Marina screamed. The priest looked down. "In a world from which no one returns." But Oleg did not want to give up. At night, when Marina fell asleep, he took a flashlight and looked under the bed. "Sonia?" he whispered, his voice trembling. He was answered by a soft laugh. And suddenly something grabbed his arm and pulled him down. Marina woke up to the sound of his screaming. She ran into the room, but found the bed empty. Ola was gone. Now Marina was the only one left in the apartment. But she knew that the darkness under the bed would not stop. She was waiting for the next victim to come. Marina could not sleep. The silence of her new reality was pierced only by a whisper coming from under the bed. It was quiet, almost inaudible, but each note chilled her to the bone. After Ola's disappearance, she completely lost the sense of time. During the day, she was exhausted by the police, who were trying to find at least a trace of her husband and daughter. At night, she would sit in the corner of the living room with the light on, keeping her eyes on the door of Sonia's room. Every time she gathered the courage to go inside, it seemed to her that the room had become different. The air there was thick, as if it was being forced out by some force. The walls seemed higher, and the shadows deeper. The bed looked completely different, its wooden carvings now resembled twisted arms curling around each other. One evening, Marina made up her mind. She turned on all the available electricity in the room, but even with the light, the shadow under the bed did not disappear. It seemed to be alive, pulsating like a breath. "I know you're here," Marina whispered. Her voice trembled, but she forced herself to continue. "You took my daughter. My husband. What do you want?" The darkness stirred. A familiar child's voice came from deep under the bed. "Mom?" Marina froze. "Sonia? Is that you?" "Yes, Mom. I'm here," the voice replied, but there was some inexplicable coldness in it that sent shivers down her spine. Marina knelt down, trying to look under the bed. But at the same moment, the voice changed. It became deeper, hoarse, like an ominous whisper. "Come down to me." Marina jumped back, crossing herself. She grabbed the phone and called the priest who had come before. "You have to come immediately," she shouted into the phone. The priest showed up an hour later. When he entered the apartment, he felt the same coldness that was there last time, but now it was stronger. "Every time this darkness becomes more powerful," he said, looking at Marina. "We have to act now, otherwise there will be no turning back." He pulled out the sacred relics, candles, and the ancient text he had brought with him. The ceremony began. When the priest began to read the prayers, the room was filled with creaking and whispering. The bed began to shake, as if something was lifting it from the inside. The darkness beneath it began to expand, enveloping the room. "What is it?" Marina screamed. The priest continued his prayers, pouring blessed water on the bed. The darkness began to squirm, and silhouettes of hands, faces, and shadows emerged from it. And then Ola's voice came from the depths of the bed. "Marina, help!" The woman ran to the bed, but the priest stopped her. "It's not him!" he shouted. "It's a trap!" But she was no longer listening. Marina bent down, trying to touch the shadows that resembled her husband and daughter. At that moment, something grabbed her arm and started pulling her down. The priest rushed to her aid, praying even louder. He grabbed Marina and began to pull her back, but the darkness was stronger. Suddenly the candles went out, and the room was filled with absolute darkness. The priest felt Marina pulling away from his arms, and at the last moment he heard her whisper, "I see them, they are there, but I'm not coming back." Then everything went quiet. When the light returned, the room was empty. The bed was gone, and so was Marina. The priest remained kneeling in complete silence. He realized that the darkness had taken them all and that this was not the end. A few days later, an ad appeared in the newspapers. Apartment for sale with a favorable location. Low price. All details are by phone. The priest who survived what happened could not find peace. He realized that the evil he had seen would never stop on its own. It not only took people, but also grew stronger with each new victim. Father Iyer turned to the ancient sources that were kept in his monastery. These were records of purification rituals compiled in the Middle Ages. He found a reference to a creature similar to the one hiding under the bed. It was called the Guardian of the Abyss, an entity that fed on people's fears and souls. The text described that it was possible to stop such a spirit, but it required a complex and dangerous rite. Father Igor knew that this was his duty. He began to prepare for the ritual. He needed consecrated ground, candles, an ancient silver dagger, and a text with a spell written in Latin. But most importantly, he needed access to that very bed. He decided to return to the building. The ad for the apartment had been up for several days, but no one had decided to buy it. Iyer contacted the owner and said he wanted to inspect the place. When he entered the apartment, Sonia's room looked empty. The bed was gone, but Iyer felt that the evil was still there. The darkness was lurking, but waiting. The priest knew that the bed could have moved. It was not just an object, it was an anchor for an entity. He began to pray, asking God for strength. Suddenly, his prayer was interrupted by a familiar sound, a rustling. A bed appeared from the shadows. It stood in the corner of the room, older and uglier than ever. Its legs looked like bones, and in the carvings one could already see the faces of those it had taken. Father Iyer began the ceremony. He sprinkled the bed with consecrated water and recited a spell. The bed trembled, and the darkness began to come out of it like thick black smoke. "In the name of the Lord, go back to your abyss!" the priest shouted, clutching a silver dagger. The darkness howled, and voices were heard from its depths. "We want to live. We want more." It pounced on Igor, entangling him like chains. But he did not stop, even when he felt the cold touch his soul. As the ritual neared completion, Iyer realized that prayer alone was not enough. The portal would not close until he sacrificed himself. He took his last breath and fell to his knees in front of the bed. His voice sounded clear and firm. "Lord, accept my soul as a sacrifice for these people. Give this evil peace forever." With these words, he stabbed a silver dagger into the center of the bed. The darkness howled and began to collapse, pulling everything connected with its power into the bed. And then everything was quiet. When the monastery priest found Iyer a few days later, the apartment was empty. The bed was gone. Iyer's body was lying on the floor, and his face was calm. Since then, nothing strange has happened in that place. The house stood empty for several years until it was demolished. The land was turned into a park so that nothing else could disturb this dark history. But the locals still avoid this place at night, because sometimes, when the moon is full, it seems that a faint rustling comes from the depths of the earth. A few years later, a park with a playground was built on the site where the ill-fated building once stood. The city authorities decided that the green area would become a symbol of new life and help erase the memories of past tragedies. At first, the park became a popular place for walking. People enjoyed the peace, the trees grew thick and healthy, and children had fun playing. But this peace did not last long. The first strange phenomenon was the disappearance of animals. Dogs walking in the park began to behave restlessly. They would growl at an invisible enemy or just run away. Once a man could not find his Labrador, which disappeared among the bushes. The dog was never found. Then strange things started happening to children. Parents noticed that their kids would suddenly start crying or stop and look in the same direction at an old tree in the center of the park. The tree stood out among the others. It was taller, its branches were dark, and its bark had a strange, burned appearance. The children said they saw a woman in black near the tree, calling them to her. One evening, a young couple was walking in the park. As they passed an old tree, the girl stopped and said, "Do you hear that? Someone is crying." Her boyfriend also heard a faint child's cry coming from the ground. They decided to take a closer look, but suddenly the air around them became cold and all sounds stopped. They were so afraid that they ran away without looking back. These stories began to spread through the city. People no longer came to the park after sunset, and some avoided the place altogether. Rumors began to circulate among the locals that an old tree was growing on the very spot where the bed had stood. They said that the darkness had not been completely destroyed, it had only been closed, but the roots of the tree had become a new link between the world of the living and the abyss. One of the monks who knew Father Iyer decided to check it out. He came to the park at night and sat down near the tree and began to pray. At first the night was quiet, but then a whisper came from the ground. "You cannot save them. They are already ours." The monk realized that the spirits taken by the darkness were still here. Their souls had not found peace. He decided to act, but he needed help. He turned to priests from different churches, and they held a joint ceremony. It was decided to sanctify the entire land, dig up the roots of the tree and perform a purification ritual. When they started digging, they found the remains of an old wooden bed frame under the tree. It was half decomposed, but in its core they found something that looked like a coal that was still smoldering. The priests surrounded the thing in a circle with prayers. The ember began to smoke, and screams came out of it, the voices of people who had disappeared earlier. It was the last trace of darkness. Eventually, the coal burned completely, and everything became quiet. Since then, the park has become safe. But locals still say that on dark nights, a faint whisper can be heard near the former site of the tree. Those who risk coming closer claim to hear one word: "We are waiting." After the cleansing ritual, the park became a peaceful place, but the feeling of unease never completely disappeared. Many people still avoided it, especially at night. However, the city authorities decided that it was worth restoring the reputation of this area. A small fountain was built on the site of the unfortunate tree, and benches were installed nearby. It seemed that the past was in the past, but it was an illusion. 10 years have passed. A young family appeared in the city, a man, a woman and their little daughter. They had just moved and were happy to find an apartment near a park. The place seemed cozy and quiet. One evening they decided to take a walk. Their daughter, 4-year-old Anya, ran to the fountain with joy. Her parents sat down on a bench nearby, watching the child. "Mom, look! There's an ant!" Anya exclaimed, pointing to the fountain. Her mother looked around but saw no one. "What ant, dear? We're the only ones here." "She's there, in the water," the girl said, leaning slightly toward the fountain. "She says she's cold and needs help." The mother looked intently at the fountain. The water was calm, with only the trees and the evening sky reflected in it. "Don't imagine things, Anya," she said, feeling a slight chill down her back. But the girl remained where she was. She was listening to something her parents couldn't hear. "She says she wants to play with me," Anya whispered, as if addressing someone invisible. The father got up, walked over to his daughter, and took her hand. "That's enough, Anya. Let's go home, it's late." The girl frowned, but went with her parents. However, she remained silent the whole evening, as if she was deep in thought. The next night something changed. Anya was woken up by a faint whisper. "Come to me. We'll play." The girl sat up on the bed and saw a shadow standing in her room, near the window. It had a female form, but no face was visible. The shadow stretched out its hand to her. "Come with me, little one. It's so much fun here." Anya, mesmerized, got out of bed and followed the shadow. The shadow led her out of the apartment, through a quiet corridor, and on to the park. The fountain glowed with a dim silver light, and darkness rose from its water. When her parents woke up, they did not find Anya in her room. All the doors and windows were locked. The only trace was a small puddle of water near the front door. The mother screamed, and the father ran to the park. There, near the fountain, he found Anya's little toy, which the girl never let go of. but the child herself was gone. After this incident, the park became a place of horror again. The police were unable to find Anya, and witnesses began to report strange phenomena: child footprints in the morning, strange voices coming from the fountain water, and shadows appearing at night. The locals realized that the darkness had returned. And now it was even more cunning. It was waiting, and looking for new souls. Like and subscribe to the channel.